Stripped of her father's ranch, her name, and every cent to her belonging, a 19-year-old girl was cast into the mountain snow with nothing but the clothes on her back, and what she found waiting for her in an attic no one remembered would turn her into the one thing her stepmother never expected: untouchable. Wynne Calloway stood in the doorway of the only home she had ever known, snow gathering on her shoulders like the ash of something already burned to nothing, and listened to the woman who had married her father 3 winters past tell her she was no longer welcome under that roof. "You are 19, said Delphine Calloway, arms folded over the fine wool shawl that had once belonged to Wynne's own mother. "Old enough to make your own way, and this ranch has no more room for a girl who contributes nothing to it." The fire behind her crackled in the hearth Wynne's mother had chosen the stones for, the one her father had built with his own hands the summer before Wynne was born, and it seemed almost cruel that warmth should still live in a house that no longer wanted her in it. "This was my father's house," Wynne said, and her voice did not shake, though her hands, curled at her sides, ached with the effort of not shaking either. "It was," Delphine agreed, and there was no apology in the word, only the flat satisfaction of a woman stating a fact she had already made irreversible. "And now it is mine, as the will plainly states, and I will not have a grown woman eating my bread and sleeping under my roof when she has done nothing to earn either." Behind Delphine, half in shadow, stood her son from a previous marriage, a lean young man named Roswell, who had never called Wynne sister, and never would, watching the scene with the mild, satisfied boredom of a man observing a business transaction concluded in his favor. Wynne's father, Ambrose Calloway, had been dead 11 weeks, thrown from a spooked horse on the ridge trail above the north pasture, and in the 11 weeks since, Wynne had watched her father's wife transform grief into opportunity with the swiftness of a woman who had perhaps been waiting for the chance all along. There had been no will reading with a lawyer present, no formal accounting, only Delphine's word that the ranch and all its holdings had passed to her as his widow, and Wynne, raw with mourning and unpracticed in doubting adults who claimed authority, had not thought to question it until it was too late to matter. Now, standing in the doorway with the cold pressing at her back, she understood that questioning it would have changed nothing anyway, because women without paper proof were not believed over women who held the deed in hand. "Where am I meant to go?" Wynne asked, and she hated that the question came out sounding like a plea instead of a demand, because a demand was what she meant it to be. "That is no longer my concern," Delphine said, and shut the door, and the sound of the bolt sliding home was the loudest thing Wynne had ever heard, louder than her father's casket lid closing, louder than the gunshot that had, weeks later, felled the horse that threw him. She stood there a long moment in the deepening snow before she made herself move, because standing still in a mountain winter was its own kind of dying, and whatever else had been taken from her, she was not yet ready to hand over her life as well. She had $11 sewn into the hem of her second petticoat, a habit her father had taught her without ever explaining why, and a wool coat 2 sizes too large that had belonged to him, and boots that had seen better winters. She had no family beyond the one that had just closed its door to her, no husband, no prospects, and a town 4 miles down the mountain that had never had much use for an unmarried woman with no property to her name. She walked those 4 miles in failing light, and the town of Larkin's Notch offered her, in the end, only what such towns offered women in her position: a cot in the back room of the boarding house in exchange for scrubbing its floors and hauling its water. Work that paid nothing but a roof and a meal, and even that only because the widow who ran the place, a sharp-eyed woman named Odetta Fenn, took one look at Wynn's face in the doorway and recognized the particular exhaustion of a person who has just lost everything at once. "You've got the look of a girl who's been thrown out," Odetta said, not unkindly, holding her lamp up to study Wynn's frost-bitten face. "I have," Wynn admitted. "Family? What's left of it doesn't want me." Odetta made a small sound in her throat that might have been sympathy or might have been simple recognition. The sound of a woman who had seen this story play out before and knew there was no fixing it with words. "Floors need scrubbing, and there's a cot in the storeroom," she said. "It isn't charity, mind. You'll work for it." Wynn worked for it. She scrubbed floors until her knuckles cracked and bled in the cold, hauled water from the well before dawn, and mended linens by lamplight until her eyes burned. The other boarders, mostly drovers and traveling salesmen passing through on their way to somewhere better, paid her little mind beyond the occasional order barked over a shoulder, and she learned quickly that a girl scrubbing floors was, to most eyes, no different from the floor itself, a fixture to be stepped around and never spoken to. There was a particular loneliness in that, sharper in its way than the cold, the sense of having become invisible in a town that had known her whole life, and some nights she lay on her cot and wondered whether her father would recognize the woman she was becoming, hollowed out by chores and silence, or whether he would have wanted better for her than mere survival. She kept his coat, though it hung absurdly large on her frame, because it still carried, faintly, the smell of the leather and pipe tobacco that had always meant safety to her as a child, and she wore it even indoors some evenings, simply to feel less alone in the world. Odetta noticed this, the way she noticed most things about the people under her roof, and said nothing about it, only left an extra biscuit on Wynn's plate some mornings without comment, a small kindness that Wynn understood better than any words could have expressed. And through it all she thought of her father, of his hands rough with rope burn, of the way he used to hum some tuneless thing while he mended fence, of the last conversation they'd had before the accident, when he had gripped her shoulder with unusual intensity and said, "Wynn, if anything ever happens to me, you go up to the old line shack, the one past the ridge, past where the pines thin out. You remember it?" She had laughed at him then, told him nothing was going to happen, and he had not laughed back, only repeated himself with that same strange gravity, and she had promised, mostly to end the conversation, that she would remember. She had not thought of that conversation once in the chaos of his death and her banishment, not until she lay on her cot in Odetta Fenn's storeroom 3 weeks into her new and diminished life, staring at the ceiling, and the memory rose up in her with sudden and startling clarity. The old line shack, past the ridge, past where the pines thinned. She had been up there exactly twice in her life, both times as a much younger girl trailing after her father on some errand she no longer remembered the purpose of, and she recalled only a squat, weathered structure of gray timber, half swallowed by the forest, the kind of place cattlemen used for shelter during roundup and forgot about the rest of the year. Why would her father tell her to go there with such urgency if anything happened to him? The question would not leave her alone. It sat with her through another 2 weeks of scrubbing and hauling, through the slow tightening of winter around the mountain, through the humiliation of watching Roswell Calloway ride into town on a fine new horse, wearing a coat that had certainly not been purchased on a ranch hand's wages. The night before she finally acted on it, Wynne sat by the boarding house's banked fire long after the other lodgers had gone to bed, turning the memory over and over, trying to recall her father's exact tone, the particular weight he had put on the words. And the more she examined it, the more certain she became that a man did not speak that way about an ordinary line shack unless he meant something by it that he could not or would not say plainly. She thought, too, of small oddities she had let pass unremarked in the weeks before his death, a lock added to a desk drawer that had never been locked before, a habit of writing late into the night that had not been his custom, a wariness in his manner around Delphine that she had mistaken in her youth and her love for both of them for simple tiredness. Pieced together now, in the quiet of a strange room in a stranger's house, those small oddities took on a shape she did not like, and by the time the fire burned down to embers, she had made up her mind that whatever waited at the old line shack, she owed it to her father to go and find it. So finally, on a morning when Odetta Fenn granted her a rare half-day free of chores, Wynne borrowed a mule from the boarding-house stable, packed a little dried meat and a canteen, and rode up into the mountains to find out what her father had wanted her to see. The trail was harder to find than she remembered, half erased by fallen snow and 11 weeks of nobody using it. And twice she thought she had lost it entirely before some half-buried memory of terrain guided her hand on the reins and put her back on the path. The climb took the better part of 3 hours, the mule laboring in the thinning air, the pines closing in tight and dark around her, until at last they opened onto a small clearing where the line shack stood, exactly as she remembered it, gray and weathered and utterly unremarkable. The kind of structure a person could walk past 100 times without a second glance. Snow had drifted against its northern wall nearly to the eaves. The door hung slightly open on a broken hinge, and when Wynne pushed inside, she found only what she expected to find: a single room, a cold stone hearth, a rotted cot frame, the detritus of a place used seasonally and left to rot the rest of the year. Disappointment settled in her stomach like a stone. She had ridden 3 hours on a half-remembered promise for this. She was turning to leave, already composing in her mind the excuse she would give Odetta for having wasted the morning, when her eye caught on something wrong about the ceiling, a seam in the old boards above the hearth that did not match the pattern of the rest, a rectangle slightly darker than its surroundings, as though it had been handled more recently than the rest of the structure had been touched in years. She dragged the rotted cot frame beneath it, tested her weight upon it gingerly, and stood and reached up and pressed her palm flat against the seam. It gave. Not much, only a fraction of an inch, but it gave, and her heart began to hammer as she worked her fingers into the gap and pulled, and a section of board the length of her forearm came loose in her hands, revealing a narrow cavity built into the roof space, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff with age and cold, a small iron box no bigger than a Bible. She climbed down with it clutched against her chest as though it might vanish if she let it out of contact with her body, and sat on the floor of the shack with her back against the cold hearth, and opened it with hands that would not stop trembling. Inside, folded with the careful precision of a man who had clearly done this before, she found a letter in her father's unmistakable hand, cramped and slanted and impatient the way he always wrote, as though the pen could not move fast enough for his thoughts. She unfolded it and read, and the words rearranged everything she thought she understood about her own life. My dearest Win, if you are reading this, then either I have told you where to look and something has happened to me before I could explain further, or you have found this on your own, which would not surprise me, as you are always a sharper girl than anyone gave you credit for. I am writing this because I have come to distrust Delphine, and I want you to know why, and I want you protected from what I fear she intends. The letter went on to explain, in Ambrose Calloway's plain and unadorned prose, that in the months before his death he had grown suspicious of his wife's dealings, had found discrepancies in the ranch accounts that suggested money moving in directions he had not authorized, had discovered that Delphine had been in correspondence with a lawyer in the territorial capital regarding matters she had never disclosed to him, and had, in his suspicion, taken the precaution of drawing up a second and more current will, one that left the ranch and its holdings in trust for Wynne alone, to be administered until her majority or marriage by a lawyer he trusted in the capital, a man named Josiah Wren, whose name and direction were included at the letter's close, along with instructions that this document, along with copies of the account discrepancies he had uncovered, should be delivered to Wren's office as soon as possible, and that Wynne should trust no one at the ranch with the knowledge of what she had found until Wren had been consulted. Beneath the letter, in the iron box, she found the will itself, properly signed and witnessed, dated only 6 weeks before her father's death, along with a slim ledger in his hand detailing the financial irregularities he had uncovered, sums of money transferred out of the ranch's operating accounts and into accounts Delphine had opened without his knowledge, correspondence receipts showing payments made to men Wynne did not recognize, and beneath all of it, folded separately and creased as though it had been read and reread many times, a note in a different hand entirely, one she did not recognize, that read only, "The arrangement stands as discussed. The horse will be seen to before the week is out, and no further payment will be required after." Wynne sat very still in the cold shack for a long time after she finished reading, the ledger and the letter and the note spread across her lap, and felt something in her chest go from grief to something colder and harder and infinitely more dangerous, because the horse will be seen to was not the language of a rancher discussing livestock. It was the language of a man discussing a task completed, and her father had died thrown from a horse that had, by every account, never spooked in its life before the day it killed him. She thought of Roswell's fine new coat, of the new horse he rode into town, of Delphine's swift and total assumption of the ranch's holdings before any lawyer had been consulted, of the closed door and the bolt sliding home, and understood with a clarity that frightened her how completely she had been meant to disappear, quietly, into poverty and irrelevance, so that no one would ever think to question how convenient her father's death had been. She repacked the box with hands gone steady now, steadier than they had been in weeks, because fear had burned away into something with a purpose, and she understood that she could not simply ride into town and accuse Delphine Calloway of murder with nothing but a cryptic note and a mother's instinct for wrongness, not against a woman who held the deed and the town's easy sympathy for a grieving widow. She needed Josiah Wren. She needed the territorial capital, 3 days' hard ride from Larkin's Notch, and she needed to get there without anyone at the ranch knowing what she carried. Because if Delphine or Roswell so much as suspected the existence of a second will, Wynne had no illusions about how far they had already proven willing to go. She rode back down the mountain in the fading light, with the iron box wrapped in her coat and pressed against her body beneath her shirt, and told Odetta Fenn only that she had visited her father's grave, a lie that tasted like ash but felt necessary, and spent that night lying awake on her cot, calculating what little money she had and what it would buy her in the way of passage south. $11 would not stretch to 3 days of hired transportation and lodging along the way. Not comfortably. But Wynne had learned in the 11 weeks since her father's death that comfort was a luxury she could no longer afford to consider. And so, 2 days later, having told Odetta she was visiting a cousin in the capital, a lie built on the flimsy foundation of a cousin who did not exist, she took the mule again, packed what supplies she could scrape together, and set out south along the territorial road, with the iron box hidden in a false bottom she had fashioned herself from a biscuit tin and a scrap of tanned hide, tucked beneath the mule's saddle blanket, where casual inspection would not find it. The 3 days south were hard ones, cold nights spent in whatever shelter she could find, a barn here, a stand of rocks there, the mule's steady plodding gait eating the miles with maddening slowness. And twice she saw riders on the road behind her that made her pulse quicken with the fear that Roswell had somehow discovered her absence and its purpose. Though both times the riders passed without incident, strangers with business of their own, and her fear proved, on those occasions at least, unfounded. She reached the territorial capital on the evening of the 3rd day, road-worn and hollow with exhaustion, and found Josiah Wren's office by asking after his name at the first respectable establishment she passed, a druggist who knew the lawyer's reputation well enough to point her toward a modest brick building 2 streets over. Wren himself, when she finally stood before him the following morning, having spent the night in a cheap room paid for with nearly the last of her $11, proved to be a narrow, precise man of middle age, with ink-stained fingers and eyes that missed very little. And when Wynne introduced herself and explained who her father had been, something shifted in his expression, a recognition and a wariness both. "Ambrose Calloway's daughter," he said, studying her. "I had wondered if I would ever hear from you. I read of your father's death in the territorial paper some weeks back. My condolences." "Thank you," Wynne said, and then, because she had rehearsed this moment across 3 days of hard riding and did not intend to waste it on pleasantries, she reached into her coat and drew out the iron box's contents, laying the will and the ledger and the strange note on his desk between them. "My father told me, before he died, to bring this to you if anything ever happened to him. I did not understand why until I found it." Wren read the will first, his expression unreadable, then the ledger, his brow drawing tighter with each page, and finally the note, which he read twice. And when he looked up at Wynne again, there was something grave in his face that had not been there before. "Your father came to me 6 weeks before his death," Wren said slowly, "concerned about irregularities in his wife's financial dealings, and asked me to draw up this will in strict confidence, believing his current wife intended to defraud him of the ranch's holdings. I did not know the extent of what he suspected. I did not know he feared for his life." "I don't think he knew either," Wynne said. "Not fully. I think he only knew something was wrong." Wren set the note down carefully, as though it might burn him. "This note," he said, "if it means what I believe it means, is not merely evidence of fraud, Miss Calloway. It is evidence of a hired killing." The word hung in the small office between them, and Wynne found she was not surprised to hear it spoken aloud, only relieved, in some strange and terrible way, to have her own unspoken suspicion confirmed by someone whose judgment carried weight beyond her own. "What do we do?" she asked. "We do this carefully," Wren said, "and we do it with the law behind us. Because if you are right about what your stepmother and her son have done, they are dangerous, and I will not have you riding back into that mountain alone to confront them." He explained over the following hour what the path forward would require: a formal filing of the second will with the territorial court, which would immediately call into question Delphine's claim to the ranch and freeze any further disposition of its assets; a request to the territorial marshal's office to investigate the note and the circumstances of Ambrose Calloway's death, given the evidence of the ledger and the correspondence; and, critically, discretion, because the moment Delphine learned that a second will existed and that her financial dealings had been uncovered, she would either flee or move to destroy whatever remaining evidence might exist, and possibly, Wren said grimly, move against Wynne herself, who was now the only witness capable of connecting the pieces. It took 11 days. 11 days Wynne spent in the territorial capital under Wren's cautious protection, boarding with his own housekeeper and venturing out only when necessary, while the wheels of the law turned with agonizing slowness around her. The will was filed and validated by the court, its authenticity beyond challenge given Wren's own testimony as the drafting attorney and the proper witnessing it had received. A territorial marshal named Garrett Boyle, a broad, unhurried man with a reputation for thoroughness that Wren assured her was well earned, took the ledger and the note and began his own quiet investigation, which uncovered within the first week that the account into which Delphine had been funneling ranch funds belonged in fact to a man named Otto Pruitt, a known hired gun with a history of trouble in 3 different territories, and that Pruitt had been seen in Larkin's Notch in the weeks before Ambrose Calloway's death, and had left the area shortly after, flush with cash he could not account for. It was Boyle who finally rode north with Wynne and a small party of deputized men on the 12th day, armed with a court order to seize the ranch's assets pending full investigation and a warrant for the questioning of both Delphine and Roswell Calloway regarding the death of Ambrose Calloway and the fraudulent administration of his estate. Wynne rode with them not because Boyle wished it, he had argued against it at length, but because she refused to be kept away from the moment her father's justice was finally served, and because, she told him with a steadiness that seemed to settle the matter, she had earned the right to see her stepmother's face when the truth arrived at last. They reached the ranch in the gray hour before full dawn, the mountain air sharp with frost, and the house stood exactly as Wynne remembered it, smoke curling from the chimney her father had built, lamplight flickering behind the windows where once she had sat at her mother's own dinner table. Boyle's men took positions around the house with the quiet efficiency of professionals, and it was Boyle himself who knocked at the door. And it was Roswell who answered it, his fine coat replaced by a nightshirt, his composure cracking the moment he saw the marshal's badge, and behind him, Wynne standing straight-backed in the frost, with an expression that had lost every trace of the grief-stricken girl who had once stood in that same doorway, begging to know where she was meant to go. "What is the meaning of this?" Roswell demanded, but his voice had already lost its old certainty, and behind him Delphine appeared in the hall, wrapped in a dressing gown, and the color drained from her face the instant her eyes found Wynne's. "Delphine Calloway," Boyle said, his voice carrying the flat, procedural weight of a man who had done this many times before. "I am here on the authority of the territorial court regarding the fraudulent probate of Ambrose Calloway's estate, and on suspicion of your involvement in his death." "This is absurd," Delphine said, but the words came too fast, too high, and her eyes went past the marshal to Wynne, and something in her face shifted from outrage to a cornered, calculating fear. "Ambrose died in an accident. Everyone knows this. Ask anyone in Larkin's Notch." "We've already spoken to a man named Otto Pruitt," Boyle said, "who was located 3 days ago in the territory to the east, and who has, in exchange for certain considerations regarding his own sentencing, offered a full account of the arrangement made with you regarding your husband's horse." The silence that followed was total. Roswell's face had gone the color of old ash, and Delphine's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, and Wynne, watching her, felt none of the savage satisfaction she had imagined feeling in this moment across 11 days of waiting. Only a vast and exhausted relief, the kind that comes after carrying a weight so long you have forgotten what it feels like to set it down. "I want to say something," Wynne said, and her voice, when it came, was quiet, but it carried in the frozen air with a clarity that made even Delphine go still. "You told me I contributed nothing to this house. You told me I had no place here. I have spent the last 11 weeks scrubbing floors for strangers because you closed that door on me. And I want you to know that every hour of it I thought of my father, and I thought of the man who taught me that things left behind are never truly worthless if you know where to look for what matters in them. You looked at me and saw nothing worth keeping. My father looked at a broken-down line shack nobody else remembered and saw a place worth protecting. And he was right, because everything I needed to bring you down was waiting for me up there the whole time." She did not wait for a response. There was nothing Delphine could say that Wynne needed to hear, and in any case the marshal's men were already moving, and within the hour both Delphine and Roswell Calloway had been taken into custody. Delphine on charges that would, in the trial that followed months later, include conspiracy to commit murder and fraud in the administration of an estate, charges that would see her sentenced to a term in the territorial penitentiary long enough to ensure she would be an old woman, if she lived to see the end of it, by the time she walked free again. And Roswell, whose involvement proved shallower but no less damning, sentenced to a lesser but still substantial term as an accessory. The ranch, with its house and its pastures, and the hearth Win's mother had chosen the stones for, returned in full and unencumbered ownership to Win Calloway, sole heir under the properly witnessed will her father had drafted in the last careful weeks of his life, suspecting betrayal and determined, even in his uncertainty, to protect the daughter he could not save from grief, but could, in the end, save from ruin. Win did not sell the mansion, as some in her position might have, nor did she raise it in some symbolic gesture of rejecting what it had cost her. Instead, she restored it, slowly, over the following year, hiring back the hands her father had once trusted and letting go the ones who had grown too comfortable under Delphine's brief and corrupt reign. And she kept the old line shack, too, had it repaired rather than abandoned, its roof mended, its hearth rebuilt. And she rode up to it sometimes in the quiet months that followed, not out of necessity now, but out of a kind of gratitude that had nowhere else to go, and sat where she had once sat with the iron box in her lap, and thought about how close she had come to losing everything, and how the smallest, most forgotten places sometimes held the largest truths, if a person was only willing to climb high enough and look hard enough to find them. She hired a young hand named Dorsey Fitch, a steady, uncomplaining worker who had once been turned away from the ranch by Delphine for the crime of asking too many questions about the books, and made him foreman within 2 years, trusting him with the same easy confidence her father had once shown to men who earned it honestly. She rebuilt the herd, thinned and neglected under Delphine's mismanagement, buying good stock with the funds Boyle's investigation eventually recovered from the accounts Delphine had hidden. And within 3 years, the Calloway Ranch was, by every measure the mountain used to judge such things, thriving in a way it had not thrived even in her father's best years, because Win brought to it both his patience and a hard-won wariness he had never needed to develop himself. She never married in haste, despite the interest of more than one rancher's son in the valley, who fancied himself deserving of a prosperous young widow's heir. And when she did eventually marry, some years later, it was to a quiet, capable man who had first come to her attention not through courtship, but through an honest disagreement about fence lines, settled over her kitchen table with a fairness that told her more about his character than any amount of flattery could have. Odetta Fenn, when she learned the full truth of what had happened to the quiet girl who had once scrubbed her floors without complaint, wept without shame, and refused, for a long time afterward, to accept a single dollar of the money Win tried to press on her in gratitude, until Win simply began sending supplies to the boarding house instead, flour and coffee and good wool blankets, things Odetta could not in good conscience turn away, and the two women remained close for the rest of their lives, bound by a debt neither of them ever spoke of again, because both understood it had already been repaid many times over. Josiah Wren continued as the Calloway Ranch's lawyer for years afterward, and Marshal Garrett Boyle, when his duties brought him anywhere near Larkin's Notch, always found reason to stop at the ranch for a meal, welcomed each time with the particular warmth reserved for a man who had ridden through frost and uncertainty to see justice done for a girl nobody else had believed worth the trouble. And Wynne Calloway, 19 years old when she was cast out into the snow, with nothing but $11 sewn into a hem and a half-remembered promise to a dying man's instructions, grew into the kind of woman the whole mountain came to speak of with a particular respect, not because she had reclaimed a fortune, though she had, but because she had done it with her own hands and her own patience and her own refusal to disappear quietly the way she had been told to. And she never forgot, not for one single winter of the many that followed, that the attic no one remembered had held not just her father's wealth, but his final act of love, waiting patiently in the dark for her to come and claim it. If this story of betrayal, hidden truth, and hard-won justice kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next tale of hardship and triumph. And drop a comment below letting us know which moment hit you hardest, because we read every single one and love hearing from you.